Hi everyone, here is the time-lapse video of the character illustration for the main hero character in the retro pixel art action game called DaemonClaw that we're working on here at Bitbeam Canon. As always, I started with pencil and very lightly sketched in a very rough general shape to place the character on the page to make sure I had room for everything. And then I just kept refining the shape, making sure the proportions were the way I wanted and that the limbs fell into place for the overall pose and to properly fill the space on the page. And once the overall pose was well established with proper proportions and perspective, then I really started moving into specific details which I had already worked out in a digital sketch using something like a Wacom tablet or Wacom monitor so that I could just work really quickly and undo and redo and scale things as much as I needed to come to the final design for especially the costume and also the coloring of the character's clothing and armor. And so you can see I just keep moving around and getting to more and more refined details. And soon you're going to see that I'm going to switch from the drafting pencil that I have right there on the screen with an F lead in it to a more typical and finer point mechanical pencil with an HB lead in it, and I think it's a 0.7 millimeter lead, and that's just to get even finer detail in there and to darken up because it'll draw with darker lines. It'll really allow me to make the final lines that I want to then go over in the inking process even more accurate. So there it is, there's the new pencil. Especially with the face, I really want to make sure that the sort of final lines that I want to ink over are nice and very clearly visible over all the sketchier lines that now I don't have to erase at this point because it's very clear and easy to see what are the final lines and what were just lines there to help establish the drawing up to this point. And you can't see if I did this in this time-lapse video, but it's always a good idea when working on a fairly complicated and detailed illustration, especially if it's of a human figure or face or both. It's a really good idea to take breaks in between, come back with a fresh eye. The other trick is to look at your artwork up in a mirror so you can see it reversed, which will really help you see proportional details and weird slants going in your drawing that you otherwise really can't see without not looking at your drawing for a very long time, for several days, and coming back with that fresh eye I was speaking of. The way to have that fresh eye instantly is to look at your artwork in the mirror. And of course, if you're working digitally, then you can simply flip your canvas or flip the image back and forth as much as you need to while you're working on it. And that really helps you avoid those internal biases that we all have. So here you can see I was happy with the pencil work, and I moved on to inking with fairly standard disposable micron pens that are very common and popular among manga artists and comic book artists. And one thing that you can't really tell in the sped up video is that I'm fairly frequently changing which pen I'm using. The set has pens that all have different thicknesses that draw different thickness lines. And it really helps in illustration to use what's called varied line width, and there's two major ways to use this. Usually we're talking about in a single stroke even, in one line of the inked illustration, the point will go from fine to thick and then maybe back to fine again over the course of the stroke. But then there's also just the idea of having different thickness or weights of lines in different areas of the inked drawing. And the easiest major rule to remember that helps give even your unshaded, uncolored inked illustration, it helps give it three-dimensional form and a sense of light and shadow, is use your thicker lines in the opposite position of the light source. So if the light source is in the top left, then make your lines thicker at the lower right, wherever there's a line in the lower right then of any part of the illustration, then you would thicken those lines. And you can see that I'm using actual thick black lines to help cast shadows under the parts of the armor that have a lot of dimension and would cast a shadow down onto the next part, such as the shoulder, armor down to the lower plate of shoulder armor and then down to the biceps, you can see those thick lines, but you can even see on the underside of that bicep there, on the arm with the big giant gauntlet, you could see that the understroke, the under part of that line that delineates the bicep is a lot thicker on the underside of the bicep than it is on the side. So that's the general idea, and you're mostly thinking about light source, but you're also thinking about how to separate one thing from another. And since there's no color or shading to help separate things, one thing that can help you pop out like a front limb that's overlapping a back limb or the body is to give it a thicker outlines than the limb in the back or the body part that it's overlapping. And speaking of that giant gauntlet, this character was designed, as I said, for that video game, and in the plot of the game, he is given, at the start of the game, a magical bracelet that once it absorbs enough magical energy from defeating enemies, then it will basically conjure a really cool magical gauntlet around that arm that will give him added strength and magical attacks. And the gauntlet takes on a different form for each level once he earns it for that particular level. So there's like a flame-based one and a lightning-based one and so on and so forth. And this particular one depicted here is the flame one, which will become really obvious once I get into the coloring stage of this illustration. And here the illustration is getting very close to done, where I'm just working in final details, but then I really decided, after all, I wasn't completely happy with how the face and the head turned out. So I actually scanned the finished illustration, removed the head digitally, printed it back out onto the same type of comic illustration board, redrew the head to just come up with a better likeness to how I envisioned the character, and then right here you see I'm just re-inking the new head, and I was much happier with the way that head turned out. And now the coloring phase is about to begin, and in my past experience with the previous illustrations I had done, I was getting frustrated with the fact that with markers you had to worry about them being dried up or drying while you're using them, or finding out that you don't have a color that you need and having to wait and run back out to a store or order markers at several dollars a pop to finish coloring your illustration. So I decided to go a different route and actually buy some acrylic artist inks, which offer a lot of benefits, including which, if you buy a primary color set, and you see there I actually bought a 50 pack of little eyedropper style bottles that I could mix my own colors into. And in this way I basically have an unlimited range of colors, and there's no risk of really running out of a marker mid-coloring job or missing a color that I don't have. I can literally pre-mix any colors I know I'm going to need, and I can adjust them on the fly. If I need a slightly yellower tint, I can mix in a little bit of yellow, and so on and so forth. So it just really was a much better and more freeing and worry-free experience. And then the other benefit is artist acrylic inks are much more permanent in what's called light fast, which means they're not going to fade over time, even in fairly direct sunlight. Whereas alcohol-based artist markers, while they look fantastically brilliant and vivid just after you color them, with age they discolor and fade, and some colors kind of turn brown or yellow very quickly over time compared to these artist inks. And because I'm going to be selling and giving away these finished illustrations, I really want them to last, for people to be able to put them on their wall and they're going to look just as good as they do now 10 years from now and even further down the line. So you may have noticed that because these are transparent inks, which is very similar to the alcohol-based artist markers, because they're transparent, you build up. You don't want to cover up where there should have been a highlight. You work from the lightest colors and you add the darker colors on, and then to keep a white highlight, what you want to try to do is actually just never have painted there on the paper to leave the white paper showing through. So that's what you've seen so far in this process, where I go around and I build up with my lighter colors, let those dry, and then keep building successive layers of darker colors on to get all my shading. And when you're coloring or shading or both, it's really important to keep not just color and light and shadow in mind, but actually the specularity, or how that particular surface that you're painting or shading reflects light and casts shadow, or has shadow cast upon it. Obviously, someone's human skin behaves very differently with light than metal or different types of plastic or glass or ice or fabric or all of those kinds of things. So it's really important to keep that in mind and to shade, basically deciding not only where your shadows are, but what shape they are and how big they are. And that's especially also true with the highlights. If something is very shiny, the really white, bright highlight part tends to be very localized to a specific area, but you can also use more almost linguistic communication style in your shading. Like you might be able to notice in the Gauntlet, when you look at the finished thing, I added the very cartoony diagonal sort of almost stripe work in the shading to give it that metallic sheen sensibility. So it might not be 100% realistic, but it helps reinforce that different things reflect the light in different ways, and it's a cue to the viewer to help them not just see the colors things are, but actually kind of feel what kind of surface those things are made out of. And just as with the drawing and the inking process, as I first tend to block in the overall detail, overall color, like the big things, the major things, I then move around and work on the finer and finer details. And in the case of coloring with transparent colors, you're looking toward what needs to be made darker to create more shadow, more illusion of form, more illusion of depth, help separate one thing from the other. You'll see there I put darker shadow colors on his torso under where the pectoral armor and his arm are, because that not only would that be in shadow, but by putting it in deep shadow, that helps the chest armor and the arm stand out in three-dimensional form from that side of the chest. So you could see there with the boots, I'm shading, I'm coloring, I'm adding different texture with the leather parts of the boots compared to the metallic part. And even in the metallic shin guards, you have the lighter blue, very shiny, smooth surface, and then you have that more ornately carved surface, which does not cast highlights on it the same way. So again, you can't just worry about color, you can't just worry about where your light source is, you have to worry about everything combined. And for this last flame effect around the gauntlet, I used the white ink that came with the set and mixed in colors so that they would be able to overlap the already dark colors in the armor and the pants there, and used sort of a dry brushing effect to get a little bit of texture in the flame. And there you see the finished inked version and the finished colored version. And I hope that was an entertaining watch. Thanks very much for watching.
If you enjoy our content and want to keep up to date on our games, please leave a like and subscribe. Also, if you want to support our projects, consider becoming a patron. The link's in the description, and we'll see you soon.